to the next panel, which is, of course, one of the most interesting panels. How do we transition the grid to a zero carbon grid and have it operate that way? And of course, the grid operating in California is the California ISO. The California ISO is represented here very strongly today, with myself being a commissioner on the ISO board, Mark Ferrin being a commissioner on the ISO board, previously on the Public Utilities Commission, and of course our fearless chair of the board, David Olsen, who's going to be the moderator of the next panel. And it's been a great pleasure to work with David. David has been reappointed to the ISO now 2 times by Governor Brown, and we all work together to ensure that we can transition to a 100% renewable energy grid in California in a safe and reliable manner, and while we operate the markets. David was also the managing director of Western Grid Group, but what's not well known about him was that he was also the CEO of Patagonia. So even though he is a market advocate and a leader in the energy imbalance market and a visionary and a thought giant in terms of integrating the operation of all the markets, making sure that the balancing of authorities work together well, and then we transition to an integrated Western grid. So I've learned a lot. It's been a pleasure to work with him, and he knows how to figure out what is the most important challenge that we have before us, how do we transition in the best way, and how do we optimize all optionalities so we're the best grid operator that can be out there. And as an example of that, we've become a beacon of international and global leadership and excellence. We've had over 170 countries represented in terms of visitors from around the world visiting the California ISO in the last 2 years and trying to learn what's the best way to integrate renewables. So to take us to the next panel, that's going to be an exciting discussion, including 2 representatives from the international community. Please welcome Dave Olsen.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much, Angelina. It's been great working with you. ISO has emerged as a real leader in this transition. So thinking about this morning's session, decarbonizing buildings, decarbonizing transportation, the grid, electricity is what ties all that together. The electricity industry is changing very, very rapidly. We have some terrific people to talk about this today. So Rick O'Connell is the executive director of GridLab, a new organization he'll tell you about. Susan Kennedy, CEO and founder of Advanced Microgrid Solutions. Harry Lehmann, the Director General of Germany's Environmental Protection Agency. Geoff Syphers, Executive Director of Sonoma Clean Power, and Talita Porto, and the Board of Directors of Brazil's Market Operator. Their bios are in your program. Please take a look. They all have tremendous experience and background. So the 2 dynamics that are really transforming the electricity industry are decarbonization and decentralization. And they're complementary and interdependent. So renewables need larger regional or continental grids and broader markets. Decarbonization needs more local control, close to customers, because we're going to have to electrify just about everything. So operating grids with non-fossil resources requires changing a lot of our operating practices. So the grids we have been designed around fossil fuels, nuclear, hydro. So we have variable resources. A lot changes, including, importantly, the way that we optimize dispatch. Right now, we do that all based on locational marginal prices, which are based on variable cost. But we're transitioning to a world with resources that don't have variable costs. So that's going to be a big change. And so not only do we have to change operating practices, we have to change the way we think about electric service as well, with decentralization really being very, very important. So this transition is happening around the world. We're going to hear experiences in Germany and Brazil. But just to emphasize that point, I'm going to start with a very brief glance at Portugal. So the CEO of Portugal's ISO grid operator wanted to be here today because he sent this slide. You can see right in the middle here, pathways to 100% renewables. Portugal has great news that in last month, the month of March 2018, the entire country was powered by 100% renewable energy. So no fossil fuel dispatched to meet the load, to serve load in the month of March. So Portugal has challenges that many grid operators do, one of them being the geographic location of the renewable. So in this slide, you can see the different zones around Portugal on the left. And you can see in the graphs, so the yellow is all renewable production, and the blue is traditional production, fossil production. So in the northern region, the top left here, you can see there's much more renewable generation than the load in that particular region, and ditto on the central region. But then you go to Lisbon, and there's very little renewable production. So the challenge that Portugal has, as California has, and many other, Germany certainly has, is moving the renewables around, sharing the renewables around. Portugal has been very strategic about how they locate their renewable resources. In particular, locating them to support local distribution, to facilitate the development of local distribution grids, in part to minimize the cost of new transmission. So I think Portugal is a really good illustration of how larger grids are really necessary to both share resources, smooth out the variability of wind and solar resources, provide a broader market, but also do that in a way that can complement local generation being developed. So that's a brief view of the Portuguese situation, and that comes to us by way of Angelina, who's traveling the world finding these great examples. So we're going to go on to our panel now, and we're going to have short statements from each of them, each of the panelists, to tell you about their work and introduce their perspectives. So when we get into discussion, you'll have an idea of their particular interests. So we'll have some presentations, very brief presentations, and then we're going to get into a discussion of some of the issues involved in how our grid is changing and how we can guide that transition. So Susan, I'd like to start with you and Advanced Micro Devices. Advanced Microgrid Solutions.
Your lips to God's ears. I'll take that valuation anyway.
Yeah.
So we are definitely seeing the beginning of a complete worldwide transformation of the way we generate, procure, distribute, and consume electricity. And if you don't, let me tell you a little bit about what AMS does. We've designed a software platform that optimizes distributed resources and monetizes resources in the wholesale markets. And when we started the company, we were trying to solve a problem in Southern California when San Onofre was taken out of the portfolio. It created a major hole in the capacity down in this area of LA, or area of Southern California, and it's a capacity constrained basin. So you can't build a peaker plant in downtown LA even if you wanted to. And so we decided to use the load itself as a virtual power plant, but do it in a way that hasn't been done before. by trying to control the whole load of a building and not just shape it a little bit, but try to literally harness the whole load of very large buildings and concentrate it around substations, so it could literally be transacted by the utility and the DSO and at the wholesale level as if it was a firm dispatchable peaker plant. And our first projects went live in last November. Our first fleet of hybrid electric buildings went live. We were dispatched 32 days in a row, 32 business days in a row, flawlessly, 0 customer fatigue, 100% delivery. Never been done before in the history of demand response. And the end-use customers love it because it's shaping their costs, and it's very user-friendly for the utility to be able to use it as a load-following resource and as a peaking resource. So we think we got the business model right. And so we invested very heavily in the software platform that optimizes and monetizes distributed resources behind the meter for the end-use customer: solar, storage, fuel cells, backup generation, all the technologies that customers are installing, and then harness the load. And we have a trading platform that monetizes those aggregated resources in the wholesale market, wherever the wholesale market ancillary services exist. In the U.S., the markets are a little more nascent than in some areas, but in areas like Australia, a few other places where you've got healthy wholesale markets, we're seeing this massive explosion of the need for these kind of optimizing software. So what we're seeing in the world is that renewable and distributed generation has completely changed the way we not only generate, but procure, distribute, and consume energy. With solar and wind prices down at below 3 cents a kilowatt hour, the consumption is now irreversible. It's mass consumption. Jonathan mentioned it earlier, the Googles, the Amazons, the Nikes, the Kaisers, the Johnson & Johnsons, they're all moving to 100% renewable energy. And and customers are putting on rooftop solar and other distributed clean resources because they can, because the price point has come down so low that the utility can't even compete with their own customer in terms of selling them electricity at a higher price. They're in a price war with their own customers, at a price war they cannot win. And so the mass deployment of these resources is irreversible. Countries like Australia, Brazil, Germany, Mexico, UK, they're headed either at or near more than 50% penetration of renewables today. And with the electric vehicle charging in particular is changing the shape of the grid and will impact 25% of the global car fleet over the next decade or so. If you look at, this was a study done by up at SMUD, in a planning process for what happens on transformers and circuits with voltage issues from the solar PV and electric vehicles. And you can see the red areas are all either voltage violations or transformers that are stressed. 20% of their circuits are experiencing stress. The DSOs can't see this, they can't plan for it, they can't control it. So these are the challenges that the grid operators are having to deal with in terms of how they manage the grid. And this is a very, very expensive problem that affects consumers as well as distribution and transmission system operators. We're moving completely away from the old paradigm into a brand new world where in the old paradigm you had a fairly static load curve and you had all the resources stacked in terms of when you would need them for peaking, and the last two on top, the load following and the peaking resources, are the ones that you need to be able to respond quickly and be on spinning reserve or be available depending on how good your forecasting is. That is now gone, completely out the window in any area where you have a significant penetration of renewables. And the new paradigm is on the right, which is the new net load curve, which I'm sure you all have seen from the CAISO, as all the renewables come on between now and 2020. Now you have a situation where you have dynamic intermittent generation and you have dynamic supply. Dynamic consumption. So for planning purposes, the utilities and grid operators are chasing a moving target on both ends of the balance supply and demand balance equation. That is an extremely expensive problem to try to solve. And basically the load following and the peaking resources are now, it is uneconomic for that to be procured or generated at the wholesale level and sold to an end use customer. So what we're seeing is that customers are, because of the price points of these technologies, are installing at a mass scale. And energy storage is now the killer app for demand response. So customer-controlled load is now a much more cost-effective way for large-scale energy users to basically consume clean energy by controlling their own load. It also means that they can respond to any price signal that a utility gives them. So if a utility wants to recover their costs through system peaks later in the day for everybody who put on solar, and then so now they're shifting the demand charges and system peak to the end of the day, customers are putting in storage, and they'll say, fine, I'll just shift my load again. So utilities have no way to recover their costs when they're installing these. So what's happening is the load following and the peaking resources are moving to wholesale markets. Wholesale markets that exchange in the day ahead, and in the real-time market, the prices for those are becoming very attractive, and customers are putting in the equipment that allows them to participate in the wholesale markets. So you're seeing a major shift, a major flip upside down of grid economics, where customers are going to have the most valuable resource to be able to provide those load following and ancillary services in the real-time market to grid operators, and it basically eliminates the middleman. It eliminates aggregators, it eliminates the utilities, it eliminates all the wholesale energy providers that are trying to sell those resources into the grid because they become a more competitive producer of these load following and ancillary service resources. And so getting to 100% in 10 years, I absolutely think it's possible. It's going to come from the end-use customer. It's going to start with the end-use customer.
Good. A lot of really important points I think we'll follow up on there. Certainly on a low-carbon grid, demand is going to have to be as important as supply. So that's one of the things that we'll follow up on. Geoff, let's go to you next. Tell us about Sonoma Clean Power.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. So Sonoma Clean Power is a community choice provider, and basically what that means is public governance and oversight over power supply, power portfolio sources, and customer programs. So we don't manage the grid assets other than power generation. And I think what I can add here is first, to be grateful that we're having a conversation that's not about the price of renewables. Isn't that nice? It's about reliability now. And maybe to share one of the lessons or one of the tools we've used in our own planning. So we're only 4 years into serving customers. We're still fairly new. But when we began, we started with a thought experiment that said, let's work backward from 100% renewable energy. Let's work backward from affordable, reliable, zero carbon energy for all human purposes available to everyone. And what do you have to do to get there? And what does every decade look like along the way? And by working the problem backward, it assumed the end state happened, which is different than saying, what incremental progress can we make today? And it meant that there were problems we didn't know how to solve, but we knew we had to solve. And that was super rich information because we were able to identify some of those problems and put them out to our friends to help us, share it to policy advocates and others. And so one of the things we realized in that experiment was we're moving from dispatchable supply and forecasted load to forecasted supply and dispatchable load as a general nutshell. That's essentially the shorthand way of saying what our future looks like. And in order to do that, we have to be able to manage load intelligently, to Susan's point. And so one of the things that we're working on right now is putting together a tool we're calling Grid Savvy that essentially allows any number of types of resources, apps, batteries, electric vehicle charging, Nest thermostats, and so forth, to be within an aggregated resource that can be dispatched to different value points. So similar to Susan's business model, as an electric provider, we want to also allow other people who can't procure her services who are too small, they're homeowners, they're small shops, to actually be able to participate in demand response. And so we have a program called Drive Evergreen, and one of the morning sessions pointed out that it's good to acknowledge where we got ideas and not need to own them ourselves. And so the city of Boulder, Colorado ran a mass discount program on electric vehicles where they got fleet discounts from manufacturers, and we were able to provide those to our customers. We were able to essentially emulate that program. It was really successful, and so from a customer standpoint, they saw, $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 discounts on electric cars. They were happy. What the customers weren't thinking a lot about was we were providing free level 2 electric vehicle chargers to them as part of that to install in their homes. And we were asking them to allow us to manage them as a demand resource. But we were also encouraging the installation of electric vehicle chargers that would normally charge at about 80% of maximum, so that we could regulate them up and down as a full grid resource. And so that program's underway. We've got 1,500 of them out. Only 300 of them have signed up for the full grid management so far, in part because this is really hard, and from a compliance standpoint, from a detail standpoint. But I'm excited about the opportunity because our goal is to eventually hit 100,000 electric vehicles across our market, all on smart charging, as an hourly load shaping tool, so that we're not relying on natural gas for shaping. So I think if I want to call out two key topics, having a lot of renewable energy is one thing, but firming it up and shaping it with renewables is another, and it's an entirely different challenge. So I think maybe if we can add more to that conversation as we go forward, I think it'd be rich.
Terrific. So let's go to Brazil now, which has a lot of ability to firm and shape renewables. You're, I think, 80% hydro right now, Talita?
Hydro, 64%.
64% hydro?
Yeah. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. It's very good to share experience because we are, Brazil is, in Brazil, the electoral sector has its policies defined by the government, the Ministry of Mines and Energy, based on studies of the research office. We have another 2 institutions that regulate the operation, the physical operation of the system, and another institution to enable electric commercialization, CCEE, where I work. So it's different from CAISO because we are separated in Brazil. The Brazilian generator complex has installed, I think I have this one. The complex has installed capacity of 158 gigawatts, which almost 8% are represented by renewable sources. All this capacity is integrated with the interconnected national system, as we can see in the map. The hydroelectric plants, they represent 64% of the generating complex, while biomass thermals account for 9% and wind power 8%. The solar plants, which are still in development, account for almost 1%, but they are increasing. Brazil hydro reservoirs and the countrywide transmission grid are used to modulate the seasonal production of biomass and the fluctuation of wind power and solar. The system reservoir are used as energy warehouse. They may store wind, sun, and sugarcane. So our hydropower plants and our grid are essential for the economic feasibility of renewable energy resources in Brazil. To promote the growth of the renewable sources, the Brazilian government has developed specific auctions for energy contracts and building subsidy policies, such as discounts on transmission and distribution tariff of energy. These charts here, this one, shows the decrease in the price of energy traded in the auctions. Last week, we held an auction that contracted new projects, resulting in the lowest price in the history of Brazil. Wind power was negotiated at $20 per megawatt hour and solar at $35 per megawatt hour. This is important because we have been reaching solution to the problem of being able to use the source of complementary to each other. Hybrid projects which combine wind, solar, and storage technology are an alternative we are studying. Another adjustment for this new issue is find an outcome to conventional thermal production, one more flexible like a gas contract. For this, adjustments in its regulation of the gas will be necessary because the current contract structures of the gas, they have high take-or-pay and ship-or-pay rates. So it's impossible to have thermals that have the operational flexibility we need now. In terms of demand management, a tariff model structure more closely to the variation of supply and demand on hourly scale have the ability to distribute energy consumption more evenly throughout the day. Thinking about this future, an innovation regulatory framework is our goal, with clear economic signals that consider all the particularities of Brazilian energy metrics. Therefore, a proposal of modernization on electoral sector was developed last year, and today it's under discussion in our National Congress. This project provides important change in energy pricing, expansion of the free market, a new role for power distribution, as well as other issues. In conclusion, in order to make feasible and consistent increase in the renewables in the metrics, the Brazilian electoral sector will make an important contribution to mitigate the impacts on the environment, in line with the international commitment that Brazil committed to for sustainable economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talita. And let's go to Germany. So California ISO has had a lot of interaction with actually many of the European transmission system operators, but particularly with different agencies of the German government. I think there's a real cooperation between Germany and California. We have learned a lot. Germany is ahead of California in many ways. But Harry, I'd like you to talk about some of the challenges you're facing.
Yes. Maybe I start with some words about archetypes of renewable energy supply. We've spoken in the morning about 100%, how this is possible. And if you look, we have made several studies and others have done that, there are at least 3 archetypes. The one is the very decentralized. Everyone has his house, his hood organized with a little bit of battery and a little bit of photovoltaic or whatever. So that's a complete decentralized system. Then on the other side, you have the international cooperation. We buy electricity from North Africa or whatever. You have the grid going around the world, and so there are a lot of ideas about that. And in midst of this, you have that what I named regional supply, so that the regions have their grids and they exchange, they have pros and cons. So these are the 3 archetypes. And to be honest, you can not solve any of our industrialized countries with one of these archetypes. If you go completely decentralized, then aluminum industry and steel industry in Germany will have problems. If you go to an, let's say, huge international collaboration, buying electricity from Africa, you will have security problems, and you have the hen and egg problem. Who pays for the grid to North Africa or somewhere else? And if you go to regional, only to a regional solution, then you will have to have too much storage for the days and hours you don't have enough wind and photovoltaic. So And that's where the grid comes in. If you shape the right size of the decentralized parts, of the regional size, and of the amount of international exchange you have from a technological point of view, and that means also economical point of view, the best situation. But this is clearly different for each region of the world where you have existing infrastructures, traditions, people running around and gaining money with that. So that's from, let's say, a theoretical point of view. Now going to Germany, Germany means at least that we have to talk about Europe, and since 20 years we have in Europe the three parts of the system, the grid, the producers, and the distributors not more one. So we don't have more monopolies, and in principle we have a liberalized market, so every producer could sell his electricity he makes in Portugal and Germany. And everyone who wants to have a small distribution system can do it also in Europe. The grids are not that liberalized because they are monopolies. If you have a grid, you have a grid, and you have a better chance to. And so they are controlled by different agencies. And we have also a so-called Bundesnetzagentur. It's an agency which is controlling and making the net planning. So that's the situation, which is different to yours because we have such a liberalized market. I buy my electricity, it's a full 100% renewable electricity, which is managed by a company in Düsseldorf, and they buy the electricity in Netherlands, in Denmark, in Bavaria, and I'm sitting in East Germany. So, so you can do that in a liberalized market, and this is a different situation to that what you have in other parts of the world. So, but now let's look into the challenges we have in Germany. One of the challenges is that's the one pictures Germany in the year 2012. You see the red one is where the production is, and the green one is where the demand is. And in 2022, it will change completely. So we have to adapt the grid. It changes first because we are switching off all nuclears. That is the last nuke goes off the net at 2022, and that changes the distribution of utilities in Germany. More or less, you don't have any, you see that the Bavarians have problems. Now they have nukes, but after 2022 they don't have, but they need electricity. So the wind energy has to be transported from north to the south and other things. So that's one of the challenges, adapting the grid to the new geospatial distribution of demand and supply. The second thing is that if you look at the almost 40% production of renewables in Germany of electricity, then you realize that the half of that is used by small and medium enterprises, by private people, by agricultural people. You mean you have small people delivering electricity. You have millions of photovoltaic people delivering electricity at the lowest level. We have 4 levels of voltage, the lowest, medium, high voltage, and highest voltage. And in a future system, you will have to give access, if you want to go to 100%, for every producer at the right level. Today, or the old system, was a one-directional system running in one system. In the future, we need a bidirectional system. We have to adapt to that. And on every level, the different producers could come in with also load management, demand management, and all these other things. Next thing we have problems is clearly that what you have told, the prices of photovoltaic and batteries are going that down that everyone in principle can go off the grid. But if you have a steel industry and car industry and all these things, we have to have a societal and political answer on that problem. It cannot be that in 2030, the grid is only paid by Volkswagen and the steel industry. So we have to find a solution of sharing risk and sharing costs. And this is in the discussion at the moment. We have a rule now, but what is the clear market for a grid? What is the systems? Who pays for what? And what is the market integration is in discussion, to be honest. And there are different views on that. Next thing is that we have at the moment, we are beginning of cities and also of small and medium enterprises of getting independent with hydrogen, with power to gas, and there's one city, Hassfeld, for example, 14,000 people who more or less they are self-supplying. They don't need anyone else. So how do you do that in a future system? They can do that because their region is a region which has enough potential. But how do you solve that? How can you give an incentive to them that they export energy because other regions like Munich need energy? So that's one next problem you have. Well, not problem. It's an I think it's solvable. The last thing is the so-called, I don't know if it exists in English, Dunkelflaute. Okay, you know what I mean? Yes, everyone knows. It's Dunkelflaute, yes? Yeah, that means it's dark and you don't have any wind. Yeah. So in this case, you will have storage system or you will have a European system that helps you. That's also something we have to do. How do we share the responsibilities in such things? So that are all solvable problems. But they need a time of discussion and they need a participation of people. Because my opinion is, and not only mine, is that if you keep the people in the game, if the people continues owning money, then with renewables and all these other things, then such a system is possible, with cars being part of load and demand management, etc., etc. And we will have also people who invest in that. And if people invest and gain money with renewables, with the future system, then they support it. One of the reasons that I think the 2 million people having owned photovoltaic are a very good argument for the neighbors, that the Energiewende is nothing bad because they get money with that. It's a joke I always make, but I continue to repeat it. If a windmill makes flap, 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 then you hate it. If it makes pling, 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 you like it. If you want to know more, it's a complicated system. If you want to know all these nitty-bitties, there's a lot of paper on the website of the German Agency for Net Controlling, the Bundesnetzagentur. And we have also on the Federal Ministry for Economics a huge bunch of English numbers, values, and all these things. I didn't want to repeat. Thank you.
Let's go on to Rick O'Connell. So tell us about GridLab. As I understand it, was set up to really get ahead of the issues of modernizing the grid in order to support transition to clean energy. So tell us.
Yeah, that's right. I'm lucky, I have a great job. So I just, with help from the Energy Foundation, I was incubated in the Energy Foundation, and I'm currently setting up GridLab as a separate organization. And so my job is really to provide technical support for energy transformation. So I get to think about these issues all the time. Although today I'm really excited. I learned Dunkelflauten, and then Geoff, I'm absolutely going to steal we're going to have forecast generation and dispatch load, because I think that's exactly right. And so I think about these sort of issues all the time about how we're going to get higher and higher penetrations of renewable energy on the grid and the kinds of things that we need to do. And I think you heard there was sort of the archetype story is a really good one, because I think many of us sort of have one of those archetypes in our minds, right? We think it's going to be decentralization, or it's going to be lots of transmission expansion or market expansion, or it's going to be storage is going to be the answer, or more flexible load is going to be the answer. And in my travels around the energy world over the past couple of decades, I have to say that the answer is going to, we need all of them. We need kind of all of the above. Because it's not going to be, we really need the things that Susan's company is bringing us in terms of that really great demand flexibility, which I think is going to be incredibly important, and being able to take distributed energy resources and turn them from a kind of a headache for grid operators into turning them into a resource for grid operators and providing grid services, providing shaping and firming, exactly like you said. And then But we still, so we're going to have those decentralized resources, but we still need the big grid. So we still need to be able to move big lots of power, as you heard from Germany. We still need to be able to move, wind. Luckily we're in the United States. We don't have to go to North Africa for great sun. We can just go down to Southern California or Arizona. Although sometimes when I go to Arizona, it feels like North Africa. And we have lots of wind in the Midwest that we need to get out to the coasts. And so we still need large transmission. So we're still going to need transmission expansion and market expansion. So NREL is just finalized a study that's in review but should be out soon, called their SEAM study, where they look at really expanding the interface between the east and the western grid, and actually looked at several scenarios of building massive new transmission. So it'll be interesting to see that. I mean, I think you'll see that study coming out this summer. It'll hopefully spark some conversation around, as a country, are we going to do real transmission expansion? And here in the West, who would have thought, 10 years ago, there was no better way than to get everybody at your conference to fall asleep is to talk about market expansion in the West. We have 39 balancing authorities in the West, and that, being able to consolidate those BAs or expand markets in the West. I mean, everyone would be asleep right now. But now it's suddenly this very exciting topic, and there's more activity in the last 6 months on Western market expansion than sort of the preceding decade. And I think that's going to be really important. I think we really need to have the temporal ability to share load diversity. We need to be able to share resources across borders. We need to be able to leverage Pacific Hydro. And because, it's not just California. We heard from Jonathan, it's not just California that has these goals. You see Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, obviously the Pacific Northwest as well. So the whole West is moving towards higher renewable penetrations, and that actually makes it more complicated and more difficult. It's not just California anymore that wants a lot of renewables. So I'm excited about the challenges and helping work through them. We're doing a really interesting study right now in Minnesota of going to 90% renewables in Minnesota by 2050. That's turned up some very interesting things that we're learning along the way on that, around the need for more flexible load. Electric vehicles are fantastic for not only electrifying the transportation, but also providing a really great flexible load to allow you to absorb variable energy when it's generated. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation here.
Terrific, thank you. So we have low price wind and solar, we have falling prices for batteries. All that's pushing us forward, but there's still obstacles standing in the way of taking advantage of really modernizing the grid. Like you guys to talk about your perspectives on what are the major obstacles that stand in our way, and how can we best address them? Geoff, do you want to start?
One of the obstacles here in California that's emerging really fast with the growth of community choice. So we now got, I think it'll be 13 operating community choice programs in the next couple of months here, and LA getting ready to gear up and do something. So a majority of the load in California will be publicly managed one way or another pretty quick here. But what that's led to is there's been a gap in some rules that's meant that the utilities, to date at least, the distribution utilities that had contracts for our customers before we ever formed, have been essentially reselling that energy in the spot market as energy. And so all of those renewable contracts that they are now essentially invisible to planning because they're not part of the conversation. And so the problem with that is, and the problem for the ISO and for others is, it makes planning extremely difficult. So one of the challenges that we're facing is we might be overbuilding one type of renewable resource and underbuilding another, because essentially this massive amount of renewables that was procured in the past is being essentially not a part of any of our planning process. So I think there's hope, because I think the CPUC is working on trying to get those contracts to be resold as renewable contracts. But that's one of the key issues right now that we're facing, and I think it brings up a point that up until very recently, renewables were renewables were renewables. And so if you wanted to buy renewables, you essentially bought the cheapest one you could find. But I think one of the tools that I would be looking for from this group is help acknowledging that geothermal and biomass have an entirely different and often higher value than other types of renewables, because they have more availability, because they have more certainty and so forth. That doesn't mean we have enough of them. But if we can acknowledge that probably relying on natural gas at the levels we are today for our shaping and RA is wholly unsustainable for the natural gas industry, because we're essentially saying we want you standing around waiting and not being paid to produce energy. You're being paid for reliability alone. And so I would love to see legislation that says, let's phase down your reliance on any fossil resource for reliability services, for shaping an RA, and start that process. Every year, lower amounts are allowed. And I think that alone would address the fact that we've got this reliability that's, the lowest marginal cost resource in California right now is solar. And so if you can build solar, you will. But I think the regulatory side of this needs to acknowledge that that can't be the only answer. Solar plus natural gas forever doesn't really solve the problem. So I think that's one of the challenges I would give to this room.
Well, the California ISO would certainly agree. It's hard to operate a grid with only PV. Resource diversity is very, very important. So some other obstacles. Susan, no, you have some.
Well, the new paradigm of demand, dispatchable load, which I love that, I'm definitely going to steal that as well, is the regulatory scheme that settles for that kind of an energy product from an end-use customer is still stuck in the dark ages. It's considered traditional demand response, which it's not considered dispatchable, reliable. The third day of a heat wave, it disappears, and so it's not given the same value in the wholesale market. But more importantly, is there's no mechanism to settle a dispatchable behind the meter resource in the wholesale market other than the old through the old demand response paradigm of a 10 by 10 baseline. So based upon what happened at the site load 10 days earlier is what they'll settle, what you actually dispatch on a particular day. And the way that works is, we delivered 100% on what we were asked to deliver with our batteries, and we were paid 80 cents on the dollar, sometimes as low as 60 or 70 cents on the dollar for what we delivered, because the load 10 days ago, the average load over the last 10 days was lower. And so when a heat wave comes and the load spikes up at the building, because all their air conditioning goes off, and we dispatch the batteries and shift the building to batteries, the load shape over the last 10 days was about 30% lower because they weren't using their air conditioning during the heat wave. And so the way they measure and settle that resource in the wholesale market is they don't see it. It doesn't exist, and so you don't get paid for it. So try telling an end-use customer that just put in a really, really expensive battery that we're only going to pay you 70 cents on the dollar on what you actually delivered. You don't settle that, you don't fix that issue, customers are going to abandon the demand response as a viable market.
Gary?
That's a good example with air conditioning, that there's also another obstacle. Too much people are thinking only in their own silos. If you talk about cooling houses, then cooling houses is a way of storing energy. But you have to change the whole system. Not only the way electricity is supplied, or at the time how much I'm delivering. You have to go to the people that are making the air conditioning system, making them more intelligent, having cooling storage system. We know that from Germany, from heating system, because we have the other game. So if you go in and you have a solar system combined with some water you can heat up, then suddenly using the surplus electricity to heat up the water is a good way of storing electricity, because you use the energy at a certain time and the storage tank holds it for a week. And this can also be done with cooling. So not staying in the silo is one thing we should do. We should think about what are the services this electricity are delivering, and how can we solve the problem, maybe with better buildings also.
Rick, do you want to add anything on this obstacles?
Yeah, I think I would echo, Susan touched on it a little bit, but I think, you said the three trends were decarbonization, decentralization, and I would add another D, and that would be digitalization, right? So your, software, but we have way better communications and software, and that hasn't really hit the energy industry as hard as it needs to. I think obviously it's still on the edges. We've got a lot of intelligence, but we still plan and run the energy system, in many ways in a almost 19th century paradigm. I mean, maybe with some 1950s updates. And so I really think, we're doing better. We're getting integrated distribution planning, but we're still, there's still a big gap between the transmission and distribution interface. There's a panel going on right now at FERC, or the last couple of days, where they were talking about how distributed energy resources can participate in wholesale markets. So I think that's a big gap, and really connecting and doing a better job of planning. And I think also, for me, it's a paradigm shift of let's put renewables at the heart of the system. I still think we're still thinking we run this grid and we're going to integrate renewables. We use that word integrate, like we're going to stick renewables around the edges. It's really, renewables need to be at the heart of the system, and we need to stick other resources around the edges, as opposed to doing it that way.
Talking specific of Brazil, I think centralized generation, the obstacle is the operation, the national operator with the grid, and in terms of decentralized, I think the main obstacle is not to have the efficient economical signal. We have to be restructure the tariff and the price to have the signal, the correct signal.
So let's follow up on this and talk a little about what we need to learn. So at the ISO, we are researching ways to eliminate gas-fired generation in load centers. And so that leads us to a lot of electrical problems. A lot of them are very new. As we think about trying to maintain reliable supply, reliable delivery without any fossil fuel at all. So, Geoff, I was really struck by the exercise you went through in Sonoma, starting at the end and working back. Did you discover things? Did that help you focus on issues that we are going to have to learn about? So identifying sort of the known unknowns that we face.
Yes, and I love Dunkelflaute. So Dunkelflaute is my favorite new word, the dark and not windy. The last 5 to 10% of natural gas in California is going to need a solution that we have no idea what it is yet. And it's 2 weeks of not much sun and no wind. And the scale of storage that would imply to maintain our current reliability is off the charts. It's just astronomical. And so we have to rethink things. And so some of the things we put on the board is our standard for reliability too high? And that's a dangerous thing to say. And I don't expect the ISO to be entertaining that discussion. But as an engineer, I know that you can build the air conditioning system for a building for $300,000 or $600,000, depending on how much of the hours you want to meet your set point. And if you want 20 hours out of range, you can save hundreds of thousands of dollars on a small building. So I think there's questions like that that are hard to ask, and that I think groups outside of the ISO should be asking. But I think.
Thank you.
But I'm happy to be asking it and not necessarily proposing it. It's more, what price are we paying for this? And so I think that 2-week period, which happens to us many years in the winter, is extremely difficult. Other things that are extremely difficult are, by our forecasts, we would need a very nearly roughly 80% larger grid in the distribution grid to accommodate 100% renewable transportation. And I see Susan leaning forward because I think you have part of the answer to that problem. And so we have looked at strategies for reducing the need for that upgrade. And I know that you've got one, but I have another, which is I would love to see a national electric code and a UL rating and local code adoption of a standard that says you plug in a device to the grid, rather than upgrading the capacity of that line, you're last in line. Your reservation code is last. You have last rights to that feeder circuit. And if there's capacity available on that feeder circuit, you get to put energy back into the grid. If there isn't, you don't. And in a way, all you need then is an electrical permit. You don't actually need an interconnect agreement because the study isn't necessary. Now you have a signal on the distribution grid advertising the current capacity that's available. That would utterly transform distributed resources, because right now the interconnect agreement and the engineering studies needed for that are the primary barrier I see in my business. And so I think that's another kind of looking forward thing as we go down the road.
It was a softball. I have to pick it up. Thank you for that. 2 things. Number one, there are storage technologies out there. I mean, most of what we see today is lithium-ion, right? But there are storage technologies out there and being developed today that have a much, much different use case available. Is Mateo Jaramillo is here. He's got technology that has a profile that could easily change that last 5% in terms of seasonal type of storage, right? Pumped hydro. There's ways of using the pumped hydro in a way that could easily solve that long duration. It's about visibility, planning, and control. We designed a microgrid for a university campus that we had to rewire their current distribution system, connecting a whole bunch of solar, and then tie it together with batteries and design it in a way for those days of consecutive low irradiance in order to get through. And we ended up developing a virtually limitless microgrid. In the case of if the transmission lines go down and they're out of power for a while, and we managed to design it in a way that would hold up for all but maybe 3 days. You know what I mean? And that you would only have to turn on your diesel generators for 3 days out of months. It was virtually limitless, but it required redesigning the circuitry in order to balance the load properly. And so you're not going to solve that problem if you just try to jerry-rig the existing infrastructure. You have to plan it.
Having brought up the word Dunkelflaute, I also want to give a solution to that. If you look at Europe, the solution is 3 parts. First one, collaboration of the different regions, because there is no wind situation where whole Europe has no wind. There's a night where whole Europe has no sun, but the wind is distributed very nicely. Second is the part that you can have storage systems, power to gas, for example. Only the German gas grid has a capacity of 3 months. So if I use renewable electricity, make hydrogen and then methane, and put a mixture of hydrogen and methane in the existing German gas grid, then I have a battery of 3 months. If I have a cogeneration system, bringing it back into electricity and heat and cooling. So that's the second part of the thing. And the third thing is clearly demand management. In such times, certain industry or others have to have less demand. And then it works. We have made several computer calculations with that. It is possible. So we don't have to fear these last 5%. You need more management, get clear. But if you build up 100% renewable system, you have to be aware that you prepare also these last 5%. And to be honest, the last 5%, it's also expensive in the existing system. So it's don't argue that. No?
I think what you're really saying is that when you have Dunkelflauten, right, all of Germany goes to Portugal. They shut the factory down. They all go to Portugal, to the beach where there's 100% renewable energy. That's a very German solution. Let's all go on vacation.
Great. So
we didn't deliver them for the wind April when they don't have enough.
So Talita, could you tell us a little bit about, does Brazil plan to get to 100% renewables? How are you thinking about that? What are the obstacles?
Yes, we are just starting because we have a lot of hydro plant and we can, the development of the rest of the hydro, it will be impossible because it's all in the Amazon region. So we are investing on another renewable, like wind, biomass, and solar. Wind, in 2011, we had only 1 gigawatt in operation. And now we have 13. That was a huge increase in a few years. And solar is just starting, but we have a lot of potential. Wind, we have a potential of 300 gigawatts. So it's a long way to the renewable, but we are going to do.
Terrific. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If there are any for the panelists. You got a unique opportunity with a lot of experts in grid thinking up here.
Yes, I was just wondering if you could
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, sir. Sure. My name's Sarah Loughran. I live in Marin County. I'm wondering if any of you want to comment on what you think the downsides might be of Western grid regionalization.
Geoff?
I think because it's not entirely defined, I think if we don't resolve our system of the RPS buckets, the Renewable Portfolio Standard buckets, I would be very, very sad. I think that system is outdated. I think that's a solvable problem. I think Sierra Club has raised concerns and others about will we still have California policy governing California's sources? And their example that's complicated, but in a nutshell is if I buy, wind from Oregon and that's no longer available to the Oregon market, do the local Oregonians replace that with natural gas and thereby causing no net emissions? I think that's solvable. I think there's a tracking system, and in fact, I think regionalization might help that. But I think my bias is toward regionalization, but I think there's plenty of questions to get answered, and on labor as well. I think how are we supporting California labor in a continued way as well? And I think all that's doable, but because it's not really, the proposal isn't as fleshed out yet as I think some people want, I'd love to see the proposal, the full proposal.
Rick, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's hard to, I think there's going to be some bumps along the road towards regionalization, but the 30,000 foot picture of regionalization is positive. we're just going to have access, the West is going to be able to share resources. I mean, the EIM, CAISO's EIM has been a huge success. More and more people are joining, more and more utilities are joining every year. I can't, off the top of my head, I think the latest savings are something like $300 million a quarter. So, from an economic perspective, from the ability to get to higher percentages, I think regionalization is all net positive. I think there's going to be some issues where, there's state jurisdictional issues. We can talk to our friends in the East. There's always some tension between an RTO and state policies, but I think those can be worked out. And I think already we're seeing the West the West is all kind of moving together. Like I said, we're seeing RPSs or proposed RPSs in many of the Western states. And so I don't think California is as much as an outlier as it used to be. The economics are on our side. And I think regionalization is going to be huge benefits for California and for the rest of the Western states.
And I would just add by way of, on this topic, I think the real risk to California is not going with regional integration. So from my perspective, I don't see any way that we can meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals or go to very low carbon grid unless we have easy, low cost access to a much larger pool of resources that we need access to for many other reasons, to share our excess solar generation at different times of day, to get solar generation from farther east earlier in the morning so that we don't have to commit gas plants to meet our morning ramp. It goes on and on and on. I just don't think that if we're serious about meeting the statutory goals in California right now, there's no way to do that absent much greater regional integration. So, did you want to say something?
I'll just add, if for every job you might lose at a gas-fired plant, you're going to create 3 with all of the load control technologies that need to be installed at customer sites. That's where the market is going, and there's a tremendous amount of engineering, construction, and technology work that goes into the load control technologies throughout the entire distribution system.
Do we have time for one more? Okay, so please help me thank the panel.